Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Ken Sasai. Welcome to GR webinar series. This morning, we are going to talk about U.S. election. The voting is coming in less than a week. This election could be a defining moment for not only for the United States, but also for the world and eventually for Japan too. And today we have a distinguished speaker and a guest, Mr. Bruce Stokes, Executive Director of Marshall Fund, United States. He's a well-known journalist, expert on public opinion survey, and he knows everything about the United States and its relationship with Japan and the other part of the world. He is also a good friend of Japan and also GR and also my personal friends. So welcome, Mr. Bruce Stokes. And today we have also Professor Nakayama Toshihiro of慶應 University. He's also the adjunct senior fellow of JICA. And also we have Naoko Funatsu, a research fellow of, sorry, not a JICA, GR, sorry. We are not JICA. We would carry the discussion among four of us. And toward the end of this discussion, we will ask all of you to participate in discussion through chatting. Without further ado, I would ask Mr. Bruce Stokes to go. Please.
Sakai-san, thank you so much for the invitation to do this. I've spoken at the Institute a number of times in the past, and each of those conversations have always been a wonderful interplay between myself and your distinguished group that you pull together. So I'm really looking forward to the questions and the insights that people have. And Naoko, thank you for your help in setting this up. And Nakayama-san, I look forward to your commentary on this. What I'm going to do is share with everyone briefly some public opinion data we have from various public opinion surveys in the U.S., very recent ones. Don't ask me at the end of this who's actually going to win, because nobody knows. You're talking to somebody who spoke at JIIA in 2016 and said, when asked that question, well, we don't know, but of course Clinton's going to win. So no one really knows what's going to happen in this election, but you can draw your own conclusions from some of the data we have. So let me share with you the mood of the American electorate on the eve of the election. As you know, it is in less than a week. American elections are, one of the things to understand is American elections are increasingly change elections. In 10 elections between 1960 and 1978, Senate and/or the White House changed hands 3 times. In the 10 elections between 1980 and 1998, the House, the Senate, or the White House changed 4 times. And between 2000 and 2018, the last 20-year period, one of those 3, or more than one of those 3, the House, the Senate, or the White House changed hands 8 times. So the U.S. political system is becoming increasingly unstable. I know whether that means that there'll be a change this time, we don't know, but the trend seems to be in that direction. The public is very excited about this election. 83% say of registered voters say it really matters who wins this election. That is, in the last 20 years, the highest it's ever been. President enters the election actually with a relatively low approval rating of roughly 42%, according to Gallup. He has been in the low 40s for most of his tenure in office. Remember, he only got 47% of the vote on election day in 2016. He has lost support among some key constituencies. This is again from Gallup. Among suburban men, he's lost 8 percentage points since the beginning of the year. Among suburban residents in general, he's lost 9 points. Among moderates, he's lost 8 points. So he's lost support in a number of key demographic groups. And his support is incredibly partisan. But this is a part of a trend in the United States. As you can see, this goes back to 1953. There was always a partisan difference in the United States. But notice the partisan difference between Trump and Biden today is 81 percentage points. Only 6% of Democrats have a favorable view of the president. 87% of Republicans do. And while there was a huge difference in approval of Obama on a partisan basis, it was slightly narrower. There was a huge difference under George W. Bush, but it was slightly narrower. So that partisan difference is getting larger and larger in American politics. Who supports whom? Yes. Yes.
Do you want to share your slides?
Oh, aren't you seeing them? I'm sorry. You should be. Let me go back. I'm not sure why we're not sharing them. That is. I thought they were being shared.
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, I'm glad you did. I did. We thought they were. I thought they were being shared. Let's go back and I'll briefly run through this. As I said, there is a huge series of change elections going on in the United States. As you can see, every 10 elections, you get more change in American politics of the House, the Senate, or the White House, which is a suggestion that we may get that again in this election. As you can see, there were 3 in the 20 years between 1960 and 1980. There were 4 from 1980 to 2000, and from 2000 on, there have been 8 changes. The public is very supportive of this election. They're very interested by huge margin. The president is not popular. Only 42% give him approval in the latest Gallup poll. His support is down among various groups, among suburban men by 8 points, among suburban residents by points. His support is incredibly partisan, 81 percentage point difference between Republicans and Democrats in the support of the president, which we know American politics going back to the 1950s has always been partisan, but it is getting worse with every president. Who supports Trump and Biden? Trump enjoys a 61 percentage point advantage among white evangelical Christians, a 32 percentage point advantage among white men without a college education. This is really the core of his support. Whereas Biden is incredibly popular among Black women, among people who live in the urban Northeast. So there's a real division demographically in this support. As most of you know, Americans are not required to vote the way Australians are. So what really matters is who shows up to vote, either the election in the mails or on election day. And historically, whites have voted most often, and that's probably good for Donald Trump. Black support, voter participation went down between Obama and Hillary Clinton, which is probably understandable, but Biden, to succeed, is going to have to move that voter participation by blacks up from 60%. And as you can see, Hispanics and Asians are increasing their voter participation, but they still vote at a much lower rate than whites and blacks. The other question is, who will the next generation vote for? Will they vote? Notice that the millennials, 14, only 20% of them voted. By 2018, which is the comparable election to 2014, because it was a congressional election, they jumped up to 42%, which is quite a jump in a 4-year period in terms of voter participation. But notice that millennials still vote at a 20 percentage point less rate than baby boomers. So if millennials are to have an impact on this election, they're going to have to increase their voter participation even more. If they do, they'll probably vote for Biden, and that would be good for Biden. Probably the most important thing to know about this election is that Trump won in 2016 because he got a lot of people who had never voted before to come out and vote for the first time or one of the first times. Over the last 4 years, there's been some debate among politicians about why isn't he trying to grow his base. But as one Republican political analyst recently said, Trump doesn't need to grow his base. He just needs to deepen his base, because his base are lowly educated white voters. And if you look at who voted in some of the key states in Michigan, Minnesota, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, these are all battleground states. These are eligible citizens who did not vote in 2016. There are more non-college white voters who still didn't vote in 2016 than college-educated whites or non-whites. And the college-educated whites and non-whites are likely to be Democratic voters. The non-college whites are likely to be Republican voters. If Trump wins, it will be because he got these people who didn't vote in 2016 to turn out to vote in 2020 for the first time. And I can tell you that in my home county in Pennsylvania, that Trump won by 2/3, he got 67% of the vote in 2016. In that one county, the Republican Party has increased the voter registration of Republicans by 10,000 voters in the last 4 years. The Democrats have only increased their registration by 1,300 voters. So the Republicans are doing a very good job getting some of their core supporters who didn't participate in the political process before to begin to get involved. We'll see if they show up on election day. The Democrats, if they do a good job of turning out, could have a chance to win Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, places like that. So it really depends who has a better. Now, as many of you know, there's an old saying in American politics, it's the economy, stupid. And normally it is. This is a graphic showing if there has been no recession within 2 years of an election, a president running for re-election always wins, going back 100 years. If there has been a recession within 2 years before the election, presidents generally lose. The only president to win re-election in the wake of a recession was Calvin Coolidge 96 years ago. So if the recession and the economy is the determining factor, one would think that Trump is going to lose. But notice this, Republicans were very excited about the economy, much of the Trump tenure. It dropped off as the economy and was hit by COVID. It has bounced back among Republicans. Democrats, not so much about independents, but the Republicans are feeling better about the economy. And that's, frankly, those are the people he needs to have feel better about the economy. When voters have been asked, what are the most important issues for you in this coming election? Notice that 7 out of 10 Democrats and 9 out of 10 Republicans say it's the economy, but notice that the Republicans are much more likely to say it's the economy. Notice that foreign policy is split. About 57% of Democrats and Republicans say foreign policy is a very important issue. I would take that with a grain of salt. When you ask voters what's a very important issue, they tend to say almost everything is a very important issue. Notice that most of And most of these issues, over half the public say it's a very important issue. So what's important is the relative importance. And the foreign policy is about in the middle of the pack, which is interesting. It's, you know, it seems to be more important to people than immigration, which is I'm actually surprised at. So we'll see how this plays out. This was a survey done by the Chicago Council on International Affairs. They asked people what would they like to see out of a Republican administration. Notice that the dark red, which is we want more than now, there are 3 times as many Republicans who say they want to increase tariffs on other countries than say who want to decrease tariffs. So it's 43% of Republicans say increase tariffs on other countries, 13% of Republicans say decrease tariffs on other countries. If you look at the Democrats, on the other hand, by 4 to 1, they want to sign more free trade agreements with other countries. By 3 to 1, they want to defend our allies' security more than we do now. And by 3 to 1, they want to decrease tariffs on other countries. So there is a real difference over some policy issues between Democrats and Republicans on policy issues that might affect Japan. On trade in general, though, most Americans think trade is good for the country. Notice that this has bounced around a bit, but going back to 2012, there's been a steady increase in Americans who see trade as good for the country. I would take this with a grain of salt. People in principle think trade is good for the country, but when you ask them a more practical question, does trade increase jobs? People say no. Does trade increase wages? People say no. Does trade lower prices? People say no. So there is a difference between their attitudes toward trade in general and trade as it affects me. China is obviously a huge trade issue and a security issue. I think it is striking that negative attitudes towards China in the United States are higher than they have ever been, both among Republicans and Democrats. And by the way, you see the same thing in Europe. When asked about specific policies of what you want done about China, notice that by 2 to 1, Republicans say it's more important to be tough on China than to have good economic relations with China. So if Trump is reelected, there is support among his base for being tougher on China, whatever the economic cost. If Biden is elected, his base basically does not think being tough is worth the economic cost. But the other thing I would note is that when asked about whether human rights are more important than economic issues in dealing with China, basically 8 in 10 Democrats and 7 in 10 Republicans say, yes, we should emphasize human rights. So depending on what China does around the human rights issue going forward, there would be support in the United States for either Biden or Trump to be tougher on human rights. Election day, as we say, is less than a week away. I think every analyst believes it's going to be a tumultuous election. This is a Pew Research Center poll that was done a couple weeks ago. Biden in that poll was leading by 10 percentage points. There's a new CNN poll out today. Biden is supposedly leading by 12 percentage points. But notice when people are going to vote. Democrats say they're going to vote either before the election day, which you can do in many American states, or they're going to vote by mail. Republicans say they're going to vote in person. What this means is that an election night, because in most states, the same day votes are counted first and the mail-in votes are counted later, that it will look like Trump is way ahead on election night. Whether he can maintain that lead as the mail-in votes are being counted is highly questionable, but you could get one conclusion on election night that could change in the following days. There is worry that has been created by the president in particular about the accuracy of U.S. elections. Notice that as recently as 2018, 78% of Republicans said they were confident in the elections, accuracy of elections. Now only 44% say that. What's changed? It's because the president has been in speeches and on Twitter attacking the accuracy of the elections in preparation for Election Day in the United States. One of the issues that you should all be aware of is that in the US, we don't elect the president by a public vote, a popular vote. We elect the president state by state in a strange 18th century concept called the Electoral College. And by tradition and by law in most states, for a long time now, whatever candidate wins the most popular votes in a state gets the electoral votes from that state. But I wanted to show you this graphic because I think most Americans don't appreciate this, let alone foreigners. Some states do not have a law that says the electoral votes of that state have to go to the person who won the election. In key states like Pennsylvania or Georgia or Iowa, there's no law that says that that's how it has to happen. And since in a cumbersome process, it's the state legislatures that ritualistically decide how these votes in the Electoral College go, if there's no law that says they have to go to the popular vote winner, there's a potential here for mischief. And that's one of the things I think to be aware of as we head into Election Day. Finally, and this is quite disturbing, 59% of Biden supporters say they expect to have a crisis after the election. And 50% of Trump supporters say they expect to have a crisis after the election. The population is primed for a crisis. We don't know what they mean by that. They probably don't know what they mean by that, but they don't expect this to be easy. Unfortunately, this is going to be a real test, I think, of American democracy on Election Day and in the days subsequent to that. So on that cheery note, I will open this up to conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. That was excellent presentation. There are very interesting analysis of the situation, some of which were not necessarily consistent with the common sense we share around here and there. But first of all, I will ask Nakayama Sensei to respond to what you explained here.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Sasai, and thank you, Mr. Stokes, for that very enlightening presentation. I think we see a picture a bit more clearer, but what we see by being clear is that we're seeing chaos. So I don't know whether we should be, calm about it. But the one thing I've noticed listening to your presentation was that you've never used the term conservative or liberal. I don't think you even mentioned this once. So does that mean there's some kind of shift going on? Because like 5-10 years ago, whenever we talked about American politics, we used the term conservative and liberal. But nowadays, you don't necessarily have to use it. I guess because Mr. Trump is not necessarily a conservative. And I would think, Biden is a liberal, but there's a shift going on in the liberal side as well. So was that deliberate? And do you see some kind of a structural shift going on in American politics in terms of this, this concept of using conservative and liberal? So that's one question I have. And the second one is that you mentioned about the Republicans more interested in sort of tariffs and all that. Would you be comfortable in saying that GOP is now a economic nationalist party? And do you see that going beyond Trump? And if that is so, I think we have to sort of fundamentally change the notion of what being Republican means and how we as Japanese approach Republicans. Because, there's people say that Japanese tend to prefer Republicans and all that, and that's because of the alliance and because it's a free trade party, right? But that seems to be changing. So, would you be comfortable in saying that GOP has become a economic nationalist party? And lastly, maybe this is too early to ask, or maybe this is too late to ask. But looking at the election as it is going now, do you think the Democrats has chosen the right candidate? Was Mr. Biden the right candidate? I kind of think he is. Initially, I didn't think so. But now looking at it, maybe he was the right candidate. I'm not sure. I just wanted to ask your perception about it. Thank you.
Answer those or?
Yeah, please.
Great. No, these are great questions. I mean, first off, I consciously used Biden and Trump simply because they're the ones who are running. But your question is more profound than that. I think that by any definition, the Democratic Party is becoming more liberal, and that Biden is actually one of maybe the last of the kind of moderate liberals that the party will produce. Now, he, in fact, has adopted a number of very liberal positions. I mean, his position on climate change, for example, is actually to the left of Bernie Sanders. But, he has in his whole career been a fairly moderate Democrat. I think on the Republican side, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we don't know what the Republican Party will look like if Trump loses. Will we get some mini Trumps, some baby Trumps in the next cycle? Or will it revert to being more of a traditionally conservative party with traditionally conservative principles? I think right now, the kind of consensus view is that the party has lost its way, and there's no going back to that, because the base of the party really is in this kind of populist right-wing minority approach, which people now are criticizing and saying it's really just a cult of Trump. But the question is, if Trump loses, does he pass from the scene? And then you have maybe some people advance who are maybe closer to being kind of mainstream conservatives. Or even if he passes from the scene, do those people say, well, the only way I can get the nomination is to out-Trump Trump and be more Trump? And that, I think, leads to your other question, which is the Republican Party becoming an economic nationalist party? And certainly that has been the appeal of Trump. There are long lamentations written by traditional Republicans now about we used to be the party of free trade and we're no longer the party of free trade. But my guess is those concepts of what is free trade and what is protectionism are changing and evolving. Biden is certainly more supportive of the WTO than Trump. Biden is more supportive of a more mainstream free trade position than Trump is. Certainly the Democrats, are now the party that at least its supporters are more supportive of trade than Republicans. But I think when you get down to specific issues, what do we do about the steel tariffs? Then it seems to me it gets much murkier, because Biden if Biden wins, he will have won in part by attracting back to the party some white manufacturing workers who voted for Trump 4 years ago. Now, is he going to turn around and get rid of the steel tariffs overnight? Is he going to turn around and not be tough on China on trade? I doubt that. I don't think it would be politically, it would make sense. And frankly, he has enunciated, some Buy American propositions in his speeches. he will, for example, put forward a massive new infrastructure spending program. Well, then you get into really difficult trade questions. I mean, where do you get the steel for that? Where do you get the things you need for that massive infrastructure program? And do they all have to be made in America? Could they all be made in America is a better question. But the point is, it might be difficult to come off some of these more economic nationalist positions. It's more a question, I think, of whether he will have a strategy, whether he will try to engage with allies on trade issues. I mean, to give you an anecdote, I have two old friends. One is the former chief international economist for the AFL-CIO, the major labor federation, and the other is former chief international economist for the United Auto Workers. I've had occasion to run into both of these guys. They both said to me exactly the same thing in separate conversations. You know, Trump is finally doing about China everything I've always wanted to do for my entire career, and it scares the hell out of me. Because they understand that there's no strategy here, right? There's no, and we're doing it on our own. We're not aligning with Tokyo or with Brussels to try to apply pressure to China. I think Biden would at least try to do that, you know. But I think you both, all of you, know better as well as I do that that's, you know, if that were easy to do, we would already be doing it. So again, it will be, the devil will be in the details, and I think that's going to be one of the big challenges on trade issues.
Well, thank you, Bruce. I found what you said is very interesting in many ways. One, I think usually foreign policy and trade, except for some specific issues, are not really the concern of general public. But that could not be the case. That's one. Number two, Democrats are traditionally believed to be more protectionist one way or another. That could be betrayed. And number three is that even if Biden will be winning, he has to take care of all these Trump supporters, even left-wing people. So he has to make adjustment. So there could be some gap between the Democrats' general preference and the specific groups of the people he has to take care. So that's why we have to look into the detail, how he would carry out his premises into actual policies.
I mean, for example, I have no reason to believe, no one has suggested to me, and it would seem to me to be the height of folly to try to join TPP, right? And it's not at all clear Clinton could have gotten TPP through the Senate. And there's no massive groundswell in the United States to join TPP. And so one of the trade challenges Biden will face is how does he relate to Asia and, of course, to China, but also to the rest of Asia when he's not a member of TPP. And, you know, advisors have said to me that their primary focus is going to be on fixing the WTO, which I think is absolutely essential, and you know, it's got to be the first priority. But those advisors have also said they aren't sure that they will be successful, and then they don't really say what happens next. But I think that you know, there's a realism or a cynicism or whatever one is call it about the ability to fix the WTO. And as some of you may know, your listeners may know, just today, the U.S., it appears to be blocking the nomination of the next head of the WTO, Ngozi, and pushing forward the Korean trade minister. Now, how that's going to work out and what kind of bad blood that's going to create in the WTO system, we don't know. And what do we do if Biden gets elected? Because then does the world say, well, you have to wait now for the next president and see what the U.S. position is then? Or does the Trump administration continue to push? We just don't know.
Yeah. Well, you think that in terms of a priority of the Biden administration, if he's elected, you know, the people say that the priority given to the foreign trade is less than what he's going to address on the domestic front, especially rebuilding the economy and middle class and all the stuff. But when he is talking about multilateralism and WTO, that is fitting. But actually, he has to continue to address all this dispute with the European Union in that context, dispute settlements and other issues, the familiar issues. But in the meantime, in Asia Pacific, there is already this TPP, momentum, build up. And that will be expanding without the United States. We know that if you read what the Biden group is talking about, there are some conditions attached to TPP. You have to have, labor rights and environment in place, like people did on NAFTA and so forth. But it is not easy, especially with smaller countries, member countries, in AP, PPC, TPP. And so do you think that there is still a chance for a country like Japan to go to the United States and say, hey, and you can't simply, concentrate on your own agenda, or even WTO. You have to be realistic. You have to address all this regional, issues, especially when you are talking about alliance, importance of alliance, defending alliance. It does not necessarily mean simply defense. It's more of the economic alliance these days. So you have to take into all this account. Does this, labor rights and environment, ideologically, we understand it, but there are some other very important agenda in trade. Do you think that the Biden people could address all these questions?
I mean, the question I think will get down to, can the Biden people in the first couple of years, because I mean, I think we have to segment it by time frame. To join TPP would require the Senate to approve it. That requires then the expenditure of political capital to get that through, because it would not be a popular move. And at least most of the Republicans would probably vote against it, not for ideological reasons, but just, if Biden wants to do it, then we don't want to do it. I mean, it's the partisanship of the US system that would come forward at that point. And when you think of all the other things that Biden has to try to get done, an economic stimulus package, something on climate change, getting his hands around the pandemic. I don't see there being the willingness to spend political capital. Remember that when Obama came in, he didn't do anything for the first 4 years on trade, and that was conscious. He just decided it was, I can't fight that many fights. And I would imagine Biden will face the same dilemma. Now, the problem is, as you say, he says he wants to rebuild his relationships with allies. He wants to, and a lot of the people who will be populating in this administration are people who were intimately involved in the kind of shift towards Asia under Obama. And so they obviously are intellectually and personally and politically committed to a greater emphasis of relations with Asia, and how they thread that needle, how they do it in a way that doesn't require the president to expend a great deal of political capital domestically, I think is the real challenge. I mean, whether there may be ways to bilaterally deepen ties with key countries, with Japan or Vietnam or countries like that, without having to do a treaty that then has to be approved by the Senate. I mean, and I don't know that you can actually do that, but it would be one of the ways to handle the situation until the politics are easier in the United States. It was, my personal view, it was a horribly missed opportunity that we didn't join TPP earlier and be done with it. But, we are where we are. I mean, the idea that Japan could stare down its own internal political problems, but the US wasn't able to stare down its own internal political problems. If you had told me that 5-10 years ago, I'd have said, you're crazy. The Japanese will never be able to join and the US will do, and it's just the opposite.
Exactly.
Can I jump in on that issue? I'm not really worried about the Biden foreign policy team, because they would be the ones we know already mostly. But what I worry about, you cite the Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll, right? And I think it's the same poll, but there was a comparison between Republicans, Democrats on threat perception.
Right.
And they were looking at a totally different world. Right? Republicans, they see challenge from China at the top, whereas the Democrats, it's global warming, pandemic, sort of race strife within the United States and all that. So that's what we worried a bit because of geographical proximity. We feel China's rise and pressure, but the people in the U.S. of course don't feel that. And I know sort of the Democratic policy experts are keenly aware of how we feel and the situation of the region, but the people are quite naturally, they're not interested in it. So how would that affect sort of, the Biden, and I know, the people don't have a direct say in deciding these foreign policy matters, but at critical moments, politicians have to listen to your supporters, sending troops, kicking in the alliance and all that. So what's your view of it?
Oh, look, it's multi-leveled, but I think you're absolutely right. I think that I would assume that Biden could not come into office and turn on a dime on China and say, oh, the Chinese are just wonderful people, and we have such, because A, he doesn't believe that, and B, his supporters don't believe that, and it would look like he was, in the pocket of Xi, when that's the last thing he would want to have, because Trump tried that, it didn't work. So I think that how Biden unwinds some of these tariffs are they're incredibly costly to the U.S. economy. We've been shooting ourselves in the foot, and how he can unwind some of that in a way that still addresses the underlying problem. I mean, the best example would be the steel tariffs. China has a huge overcapacity in steel production. It floods the global market. It has caused enormous distortions. We're long overdue going after it. But the blunderbuss approach in which the Trump administration went after it means we hit the Canadians, we hit the Europeans, we hit the Japanese. It's like what Trump didn't do, but I would assume, without any knowledge, that Biden would try to do is bring the allies together and say, look, how do we pressure the Chinese to reduce steel capacity without, hitting each other in the process? Now, frankly, there have been OECD's negotiations on this many times in the past, and they've always failed. So this is not easy. But my guess is that's what the Biden people will how they will attempt to handle China without actually backing down on China. And it's going to be up to all of us to actually come together to deal with that. In terms of the broader issue of threat perception, you're absolutely right. Democrats are much more worried about more domestic issues, less polarized around China. And I think that the people around Biden are very sensitive to concerns of Japan and Korea and other Asian allies. But I also think in the last 4 years, there's been this heightened awareness among Democrats as well, that expectation that China will become more like us and be a global citizen people just don't buy that anymore. They don't. This is Democrats who don't buy that anymore, and so they're struggling to come up with some kind of new policy, and I think it will be tougher than past Democratic policies, and how we calibrate that, given the fact that geography matters, and you're closer to, and you and the Koreans are much closer to China and much more deeply embedded economically in China than we are. Now, I think the real test is going to be Taiwan. If the Chinese ramp up the pressure on Taiwan, which everyone increasingly fears, although who knows what would happen, but let's assume this continues. What do we do about it? Because at the very highest levels in the US government, there is an open acknowledgement that we can't defend Taiwan, that we militarily can't do it. But what do we do if that pressure grows? And we would need to do it with you if we were going to have any effect on Chinese behavior. And obviously you're more vulnerable to their retaliation than we are in some way. So, but I can tell you, I've been struck by the growing concern over Taiwan in the United States, in the foreign policy establishment in the United States.
Okay, why don't we talk a bit about the elections, especially these contested states, swing states? Yeah. It's going to be difficult to predict, obviously. There is a debate and argument on this issue of Trump supporters who have not expressed their views public, either through opinion polls, survey, or whatever. And there is a view that back in 2016, there was a huge turnout of Trump supporters, suddenly mushrooming everywhere. But is this happening? Did this already happen? Or, there is more anti-Trump people, who voted Trump before, but don't want to vote anymore, including those who didn't like, Hillary, so they voted for Trump and so forth. Are they really coming back to Democratic camp? And there is not much, secret Trump supporters anymore. What is it?
Well, I mean, as a pollster for about 10 years, I've always been leery of people who say, well, respondents are lying to you, or, they aren't answering the questions. Obviously some do, right? And they tell you one thing and they're going to do another. There's no academic studies that show that is a statistically significant percentage of the population. At Pew, we ran the kind of survey for all the polling organizations in the country on what happened in 2016. And it was really kind of methodological problems that led to the mistakes. And remember, the national polls were right. They said she was going to win by 3% and she won by 2.1% or whatever. But we don't elect a president that way. We elect by state. And the state level polls that were wrong were often done by local radio stations or local newspapers that aren't very professional and don't do this very often. And so there's that problem. The second problem was that you kind of build these models of who you're going to call on the phone to ask these questions. And in retrospect, they didn't call enough lowly educated people, they didn't call enough old people, and they didn't call enough rural people. Those were the people who voted for Trump. And the other problem was that when you're doing these surveys, especially close to the election, one of the questions you ask people is, have you ever voted before? Or when was the last time you voted? And if people say, well, I've never voted, or I haven't voted for 20 years, you throw out the result because they, up until this point, up until 2016, the predictor of whether someone was going to vote is if they voted before. And if they've never voted now, they're probably never going to vote again. Well, that changed. And that was probably a mistake that you could not have avoided. But hopefully now, methodologically, people have fixed that problem. We'll see. I mean, we'll know on election day, right? But some of the differences between 2016 and now are that there are fewer undecided voters. So in theory, there are fewer people to move around, right? You have far more people voting. Over half of the total number of people who voted in 2016 have already voted by mail or advanced voting. So a huge number of these decisions have already been made and can't be affected by anything that happens in the last week or 10 days of the election. Trump's approval rating is, as we say, kind of in the low 40s. It's been stuck there through most of his tenure. Biden's approval rating is over 50. It's like 51, 52, depending on the poll. And it's going up. So, and Hillary's was never above 50%. So people actually like Biden more than they like Hillary, which may help. But I don't think we can underestimate Trump, that in Florida, a key battleground state, in Pennsylvania, a key battleground state, the Republicans have registered more new voters than the Democrats have. And you would presume if you registered to vote when you hadn't been registered before, there's probably a good, highly likelihood you're going to vote. And so that's an advantage that Trump has now that he didn't have in 2016 in really important states.
So your guess is that it's very close, right?
Look,
no, I'm just asking.
I think that Biden's going to win. I think let's face it. At the end of the day, you have to believe the numbers. The numbers and all the polls, all the legitimate polls, all the highly respected polls show him well ahead. There are, people I know who do this for a living, just cover polls, who say they think there's a very good chance it's going to be a landslide. I bite my tongue when I say that because I don't want to jinx it, but that
of course.
And a big question that people outside the U.S. should follow closely is, even if Biden wins, do the Democrats gain control of the Senate? Because if the Democrats cannot gain control of the Senate, then a lot of the Biden initiatives that he might like to pursue are going to be blocked. And and it's important international initiatives like on climate change. And I think that that's something that, and also the broader issue of if you have divided control, there's a greater likelihood of nothing getting done, right? And I've always thought, then maybe this is chauvinistic of me as an American, but the worst thing in the world is when the United States can't make its own mind up and can't make decisions, right? When the U.S. is so internally preoccupied that it can't act on anything. And that is a prospect if the Republicans retain control of the Senate. And then the final issue is we don't know what it means to have this Supreme Court now have a 6-3 conservative majority. Worst case scenario, Biden does things, the Congress approves them and the court blocks them. And again, those could be things that affect the world, like initiatives on climate change. How that Supreme Court acts is going to be something that's very important, and we just don't know because it's still to happen.
Yeah, I think there is lots of concern, not only among the Americans, as you just showed before. I mean, all worried about some crisis with the Democrats or Republican supporters. And here, reading the paper even, they are talking about the possible confusions coming out after the voting date. And listening to what you said on this binding the electoral college for the nominees and so forth, that could be enormous confusion, especially in a state like Pennsylvania or Georgia, whatever. If they don't bind, if the Republican will go to mobilize the states, parliamentary process,
right,
and try to make a different judgment and go to the court if you need it, and then. How many, all these states could be possibly within the all this confusion, framework.
Right, and it would only take a couple of states with a lot of electoral votes to throw the whole outcome of the election into doubt. And I think one of the issues would be that if we have an election, which is, I think it's almost assured that Biden will get more popular votes than Trump, because the Democrats, there are more Democrats in the country than Republicans. They're concentrated in cities. There's going to be more Democratic votes than Republican votes in this election. But then if it appears that through some kind of trickery at the state level or through the Supreme Court, Trump gets reelected, we do have to worry about what that does to affect Americans' faith in their own democracy, and the world's faith in American democracy. I mean, look, I could give you a lecture all night about the shortcomings of our democracy, but basically we're very proud of our democracy, and we hold ourselves up as a good democracy. And if there's a kind of a soft power cost if this doesn't work out very well. And look, most Americans would care less about that, but I think we who care about international affairs have to worry about that.
Yeah, exactly. That would strengthen the hands of a country like Russia and China, obviously.
Absolutely.
And it's a longer term impact on the United States position and the power to pass away. But I think we are a bit running out of time, so possibly we better ask the audience to raise the questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
There are questions from the audience today, and one is that one major factor behind the huge gap in the COVID-19 death rates in the United States and Japan is the existence of universal health care in Japan. Clinton and Obama tried but couldn't go very far due to strong resistance from medical doctors. Will this change after, I think it's after, if the Biden will win?
Yeah, certainly if Trump wins, it won't change. In fact, it could probably get worse in the United States because Trump, wants to get rid of Obamacare and says he has a plan, but he said he's had a plan for 4 years. No one's seen it. If Biden wins, he wants to expand coverage under Obamacare, but not replace it. And not, and not go to full socialized medicine or whatever. So I think that many of the shortcomings of the U.S. medical system will continue. Excuse me.
Okay. All right.
Is that it?
Okay.
Other questions?
Yes, another question is about foreign policy issues, and the question is, the problem like the Taiwan issue, Mr. Trump needs prudence, logical with the interest of the historical background and so forth. How would you assess his negotiating attitude to the problems which he needs very delicate presentation?
And this is about Biden, correct?
This is about the Mr. Trump.
Oh, Trump. I would say that my personal opinion is that there is no evidence that he's a good negotiator based on these 4 years as president. And he claims that he's a deal maker because he made deals in real estate, but There is a difference between negotiating with the plumbers union and negotiating with the leader of North Korea. And so I don't think that there's any reason to believe that he will be a better negotiator in the second term.
So the next question is, if the stock market tanks in the next few days, how would it affect the voting on the November 3rd?
Well, for one thing, we don't know what percentage of the votes are already been cast, but it's a huge percentage, an unprecedented percentage of the votes have been cast. So whatever happens between now and Election Day doesn't matter. The votes have been cast. I think that if there were some dramatic fall off in the stock market, and we're talking, it went down something like 900 points today, but let's say it went down another 2,000 points or something really dramatic. It probably would help Biden in the sense that we know from the financial crisis in 2008 that at least some voters thought, this is not working. We have to try something else. And I think that might be the reaction. But I'm doubtful whether it would have much impact in general.
Any other questions?
No, I think that's fine.
Well, thank you very much. We come to the limit of the time allocated. But again, I want to thank you, Bruce, for taking the time to participate in this GIA program. And we play for the good elections, not only for the United States, but for all of us. And I hope that the even process after voting would be contained one way or another, because if there is a confusion, and we will be suffering too, as a friend and I. So I wish you yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the insightful talks. One thing that I want to say that, Japan is looking at the U.S. elections with huge interest. I've never seen this big of an interest, much more than 2008, with amazement, surprise, and maybe for the first time, pity. It's difficult to say, right? But we're with a sense of pity. And I hope things work out, because it's your election, but it's not just your election. And its implication is huge. So I hope things work out.
What I always like to say in these lectures to overseas audiences is, it's so unfair because we get to choose the leader of the world and you don't get a vote.
That's it. Well said. Okay, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.